trazido os grandes desafios para as universidades.
And so what we are now experiencing is what's going to make a systemic change to schools, universities, and even learning in corporate environments.
E nós temos visto mudanças sistemáticas nos ambientes corporativos e em ambientes educacionais, resultados dessas transformações.
And so specifically, I want to talk briefly about some of the stages of technology that we have experienced over the last 30 years and an indication of the technologies that we will face going forward.
Eu gostaria de falar sobre esses estágios das tecnologias que nós temos visto acontecendo nos últimos 30 anos e as tecnologias que seguirão a partir daí.
The stages I'm going to talk about are what you see on your screen. They are pre-web, the early web, Web 2.0, media-rich, immersive, and then AI-influenced.
As estágios do que ele está falando são essas que ele cita aqui no slide. Pre-web, pré-web, web inicial, web 2.0, mídias ricas, imersão e influência da inteligência artificial.
So before the web gained popularity, technology was already being used in classrooms, but this technology was often more like computer-based training, DVDs, or laser discs more often, and it was typically self-contained, and it was an individual learning by themselves with a computer.
Antes da web, as tecnologias usadas em sala de aula, em geral, eram self-contained, né? Elas eram contidas em si mesmas, como CD, DVD, Laserdiscs, e sem muita conectividade, ou com alguma conectividade, porém limitada.
The next stage started in the late 1990s, which was the use of learning management systems. And the learning management systems helped to move the concept of the classroom online, but it didn't really change learning.
No início da web, o que surge são os ambientes virtuais de aprendizagem e algumas plataformas, como ele apresenta aqui, que surgem como uma tentativa de reprodução digital das salas de aula, mas sem uma mudança drástica ou profunda no modo de ensinar e aprender.
Then in mid-2000s, we started to see a new approach or technology that gave everyone a bit of control that previous technologies hadn't. And that control meant that anyone could write to the web rather than just read the web, and that resulted in Web 2.0.
Ali em meados dos anos 2000 surge a Web 2.0, que é um ambiente em que as pessoas começam a ter um pouco mais de controle na construção de conteúdo. Elas não são apenas receptoras daqueles conteúdos que eram produzidos anteriormente.
We also started to see the rise of rich media toward the, around little after Web 2.0, and this resulted in YouTube and online video instruction.
E logo em seguida a gente vê as mídias ricas, né, que seguem essa Web 2.0, como um dos exemplos, o YouTube, que oferece a possibilidade de construção de vídeos autorais.
There was another stage that developed, which was the use of immersive technologies. These are game-based, virtual reality, augmented reality. They've always had some attention in the background, but they really haven't broken through in a significant way.
Logo em seguida vem as tecnologias imersivas, ainda nos seus estágios iniciais, como baseados em games, realidade virtual, realidade aumentada. Sorry, the last sentence?
They've always been interesting and relevant, but they haven't gained much attention or broad levels of adoption.
Ok. Foram tecnologias bastante interessantes, mas que não tiveram uma adoção ainda nesses primeiros estágios, uma adoção muito significativa nos produtos educacionais.
more recently, and this is what I'll talk about in the next, in a few minutes, is the role of artificial intelligence in learning processes. There are many indicators now that artificial intelligence is going to change not only how we learn, but really what we mean about being a human being.
E aí ele quer falar um pouco sobre a influência da inteligência artificial, que é o tema principal da palestra, e ele acredita que a inteligência artificial tem uma influência profunda, não só no modo em que aprendemos, mas no próprio modo como nos expressamos como seres humanos.
There's a number of other technologies that are still relevant and important, but haven't necessarily made the same impact on education. I just want to emphasize, things like blockchain and cloud-based approaches, which are in the background. We don't experience them daily, but they're very consequential, and a number of personalized and adaptive systems.
E outras tecnologias que também surgem, mas que ainda têm espaço para ser trabalhado, como blockchain, sistemas baseados em nuvens, identidade e gerenciamento de arquivos, de identidade, e outras tecnologias que ainda têm espaço para ser trabalhado na educação.
So what's happened here is that essentially we have a system where individuals have greater control over their learning than they've ever had. And this produces some problems, though. And one of the biggest problems is the lack of coherence in understanding, because when we learn from one person, they can teach us through a textbook or through a resource. When we learn on our own, we build many errors into our cognitive system.
I think you can go ahead because the closed caption is working now.
Okay.
Thank you very much for this, for comprehension.
No problem. And if any problems arise, just let me know.
Okay.
So essentially, when we learn on our own, we can build in errors that an expert or a classroom teacher might be able to catch and redirect our understanding so it's more accurate. One example of this is what has been called the illusion of explanatory depth. The main idea here is that people don't understand the main concepts of basic technologies simply because they experience it, but they don't think about it. And as a result, if they're asked, and this was something a researcher did with a group of her students, to draw how a bicycle works, the students were often not able to draw how it works simply because while they used it every day, they didn't deeply understand how a very common object was actually structured. Another example is from Harvard. So from an MIT, I should say, MIT graduates who are clearly some of the best in the world were given a wire, a battery, and a light bulb, and they were asked to light the light bulb, and they were not able to do that, or many of them weren't able to do that. Now, this is a very basic engineering concept, and so you can be at one of the best schools in the world and still have sort of fundamental errors in your knowledge system. And part of the goal is that the school system, you think, would correct that, but it often does not. Another illustration is from a number of years ago called a private universe. What researchers did was they asked a group of graduates at Harvard why we have seasons, and the vast majority of them were unable to explain the reason for seasons. So it's an example of people going through school, graduating from the top school in the world, and still having errors in their basic scientific understanding. Now, these types of problems are or give us an indication of where cognitive technologies could play a role. What we want to see happen in a perfect world is that we use cognitive technologies to help us better understand the world around us. And we want AI. Now, artificial intelligence is a very broad term. So I mean it in a specific way, which I'll go through over the next little while. It's important to emphasize that artificial intelligence isn't something that you're going to experience tomorrow. You know, all of you have experienced it today. From the time you got up in the morning, AI was recommending social media posts. It was providing you with news that was relevant to you. If you did any shopping, it influenced most likely some of your shopping habits and so on. So basically AI impacts every aspect of your life. And we're often not aware of it. Now it's starting to impact our learning practices in more explicit ways. And in some ways that can be a positive thing because there are certain things that AI can do well. So it can model complex patterns such as climate change. It can make sense of 2 billion tweets that are sent in a day and tell you what the trends are in those tweets. It can recommend other people to follow. It can discover patterns in huge data sets and so on. So broadly speaking, when it comes to the way we want to think about AI in learning, which I'll get into in a few minutes, the current models of AI only work well when you're dealing with structured data, computation-heavy requirements, and often very rule-bounded activities. And it's important to emphasize that it's a current technology, as I mentioned, and whether you're using Microsoft Teams, or in this case, we're in Zoom, or if you use Google Meet, you have AI available in the background, helping to make sense in some ways, whether it's for the teacher, the educator, encryption, or whatever else is happening, AI is there playing a role. And the model that I think most educators need to understand is if an interaction is digital, it produces data. If it produces data, it's available for analysis. If you have enough data and enough interest on the part of corporate partners or university needs, then those analytics will eventually turn into some AI application because the analysis and the interventions will be automated. A big problem then is how do we take these outputs, namely the results of AI, and use that to help make people more intelligent or to help make people better capable of doing knowledge work. So the big focus is how can we plan in our school systems to be more intelligent with technology? Now, a quick point before I shift to talk more about the structure of information. One of the challenges that COVID presented the modern university and schooling system is that we had heard for 20 years that the internet could impact learning. Some of the things that I shared earlier reflect that. Most universities didn't pay a lot of attention to those technologies, or if they did, they were peripheral, they were secondary to the main work that the university did. When COVID hit, universities, certainly in the US, where I spend a big chunk of my time, but other parts of the world as well, were often completely unprepared. So there were these sophisticated technologies that were available, and universities ignored them to a large degree. My argument is the same thing is happening with AI, but AI is going to be more impactful than online technology is, because AI will create entirely new ways of interacting with information, and will create entirely new ways for us to structure our university system. And I'll get into that a bit more later. But I just want to emphasize that the universities that failed to prepare for digital technologies for teaching and learning, such as most did, at least at a systems level. Many did it at a much smaller, you might have a department that has expertise, but that was about it. What we want to start promoting now is that universities should be doing that level of preparation for AI, and every university should have an AI task force and should prepare a 5 to 10 year vision for how they will interact around cognitive technologies that are starting to come in with the textbook publishers, with the learning management systems, and so on that they're interacting with. Now, before I go a little bit more into AI, I just want to talk about what is the underlying thing that's driving some of these changes. And at a broad level, I'll say it's information. You know, information creates our institutions. And if we want to understand the future of education, we need to understand information. This isn't new. Education systems or any system in society that has a knowledge role always tracks what people do with information. So if you go back to Library of Alexandria, if you go to the teaching settings that occurred in Athens with Plato or with Aristotle, it was generally what people did with information is what produced the kinds of institutions that we created. And more recently, some of the library or related classification systems similarly promoted this approach for us to build systems that align with what information does. And so my argument then is that in order for us to understand what education will look like tomorrow, we need to understand the architecture of information today. And what I mean with that is that we need to understand how information is created, how it's shared, who controls it, how do we improve on it? And then a big question follows that says, well, if we are working toward an age of AI, there's a question around what should students do for themselves and what should we do for them, or what should AI do for them? But as a starting point, at minimum, we need to say that the future system of education is going to map what we're doing with information, and what we're doing with information, or what the attributes, I should say, of information are today is, you know, as you see on your screen, information is open, it's distributed across networks, it's social, it is self-organized, it's adaptive, it's global. And designing an education system that allows these kinds of activities to emerge for humans to engage in, while at the same time taking advantage of the opportunities that artificial intelligence provides, is the key focus for university leaders or for academics and support staff to be aware of. Now, with that as a background, then I want to talk a little bit about what it is that is unique about AI or cognitive technologies in general, in contrast with some of the traditional technology advancements that we've had. Well, I think the biggest difference is up until AI, we've generally used technology as a tool. And what I mean with that is we choose what we want to do. We choose the tool and we choose the task. When we start working with AI, the tool starts to change us. And what I mean there is that the tool becomes an active partner. We don't use AI only. AI also uses us, if you will. It changes what we do. It changes the kinds of information that we see. It impacts basically our interactions with the world, and it changes the types of information that we see or the resources that we encounter. And that's a big difference from what we have traditionally had with AI or with non-AI systems, where we were in control. Now, that faces then a world where we are thinking together with technologies. Or put another way, algorithms and robots are part of our cognitive system. They are agents that think with us. rather than things that we use to think. And that's something new in human history, where we have a resource or a non-human partner that engages in thinking with us. So then it comes down to, and this is a big question for researchers and academics and teachers and politicians to think about, is, essentially what is unique to being a human being? AI, we've all heard the forecasts of it'll replace many jobs, it'll impact, the quality of life for many people in negative ways, many in positive ways, but certainly many in negative. And so then I guess for all of us, the question really becomes, what is it that we want to do with our school systems to help develop our students if AI is going to become a significant factor in all of our lives? Now, let's take a little bit of a step back and talk about what different systems mean from the language that you might encounter. So at a very broad level, artificial intelligence is a statement that's actually been around for 70 years, and it's the science and engineering of making machines intelligent. There are two components often that are used to describe it. General intelligence is human level intelligence. And this means that we can learn something in one domain and we can transfer the salient elements over to another domain. Which no AI systems can do that today. Everything that we see with AI is generally narrow intelligence, which means it can solve a specific problem as long as it's a well-bounded or a control-based problem, but it cannot think the way that humans think. A second aspect is machine learning. And machine learning is basically the ability to learn without being explicitly programmed. And many of the examples that you experience daily are machine learning examples. And it's the area where a lot of the hype that we see around recommendation systems or classification are machines that have learned certain images or approaches and so on. The area that has received a lot of hype and is based on or is being used by companies such as DeepMind and others are related to neural networks and deep learning. And these are computational approaches that map the human brain system, if you will, how people think. And so as a result, that's a sort of a key output of this kind of an approach. Future-wise, it shows a lot of promise, but it also bridges a number of fields that have significant overlap. And by number of fields, I mean neuroscience, psychology, computer science, and so on are all integrated there. Now, what AI can do quite well, and in many cases better than humans, it can recognize images, speech and text translation. It can find hidden patterns in scientific data. It can help people, or it can beat people at even complex strategy games such as Go, or even more impressively, human computer competition in video games where the machine can outperform human competitive approaches. It can recognize faces. It even has a creativity instinct where it can create new recipes, new music, and so on. So there's a number of aspects that AI can do and can contribute to in helping improve the quality of our learning, if you will. One of the problems, though, is that AI, because it is not human, it, for lack of a better word, thinks in a different way. So it can make a number of what are best described as just
temos um problema de conexão com o professor. Equipe técnica, eu não sei se travou só para mim, se travou para todo mundo. Acho que nós estamos aqui com um problema técnico lá na conexão Austrália-Brasil. Vamos aguardar alguns minutos para ver se... retornamos. O meu está funcionando, já tive feedback aqui. Parece que é um problema com o professor. Mandei uma mensagem para ele, vamos ver se ele... acho que ele voltou.
All right.
You
Am I
returned.
back?
Yes,
Okay.
you're back.
All right, let me try this again. Sorry about that.
No worry. It's happened.
All right, let's see. Let me know. You see my screen now?
Yeah, that's all
Okay.
fine.
So I was just talking about AI cheats, and the way that AI cheats is it solves a problem, but it solves it in a way that we didn't expect. So, for example, a self-driving car that drives in circles because it was rewarded based on speed, or an AI agent that pauses a game so it doesn't keep losing because the goal it was given was don't lose. And so it takes different strategies. It doesn't understand the integrated nature of what we're asking it to do. So with that as some of the background, it's still important to think about what does this mean then for the school system? Like I said earlier, I think all schools and all universities should have active committees to develop their 5 to 10 year AI strategy, how they're going to prepare for it and allocate resources to it. So one important aspect is that typical systems are antithetical to innovation. So we found with digital learning, for example, many faculty were resistant to adopting technology and only did so when a pandemic hit, and then were caught off guard because they didn't have the capability. Another aspect to focus on is that systems is important for new learning and new knowledge, meaning you can't just take one part in and expect the system to change. We need to see the whole view. What are the pieces that are involved, and how do some pieces contribute to positive outcomes and other pieces have a negative impact on those outcomes? An important aspect is that culture and beingness, namely who we are rather than what we know, are really important aspects of future school systems, especially ones where AI becomes more significant. So technology then is this co-agent in our knowledge work, and an important part of the work that needs to be done, and I'm working with a few colleagues at UniSA and in Texas to do exactly this, is what needs to be done is we need to understand what is the conceptual model for how we think with technology, how we're intelligent with technology. And so we need to focus on, in this age where a machine will always learn faster than we can, because in most areas, at least in discrete areas, in global areas such as general intelligence, it doesn't do that yet. But what does that look like? And we've called this the post-learning era, which means that we need to start focusing on different places to allocate our intellectual effort and resources, largely because of how quick machines are able to do this. So we focus then on treating these agents as co-participants in our knowledge work. And we have to be intentional about deciding what should a human do versus what should a machine do. So for example, something like closed captioning that we had this experience earlier is an example of the application of some AI or machine learning concepts. And we find them useful, and they can make our experience of learning much more impactful than if we're not using them. So the question is, how do we integrate that? How do we fact check? How do we make sure that there's no errors there, and so on? What does it mean to have this artificial agent involved in our human cognitive system? And so my argument is that as a result of AI being able to think better and faster than human beings can in many areas, that we need to start asking ourselves, what should humans be doing in this kind of a setting? And my argument is we should be focusing our effort on things such as sense making or meaning making, because those are the key skills that an artificial system is not yet able to duplicate or is not yet able to achieve. So this is roughly the model that we're using in our research. I'll talk a little bit about what this is. So we have two elements. We have artificial cognition and human cognition. At the outer edges, this is about basically artificial intelligence involves basic AI research, computational models, neural networks, and so on. Basic cognitive science on the left-hand screen involves neuroscience, cognitive processes, and so on. These two areas overlap, but I'm very interested in this central part right in the middle, namely, what happens when these two systems come together to solve a problem? Like, what does a human and artificial cognition system look like for our students in classrooms? Simple example might be you could have a group of students involved in problem solving. And when they're involved in problem solving, the question becomes, what could like Alexa or Siri or Hey Google, what could an agent do to help that problem solving be better? So a simple agent that's involved in our cognitive system, while we're talking, could record the conversation, could actively be out on the internet searching for examples that support what we're talking about, counter examples that help deepen our thinking, and so on. So at all stages, the role of AI is to be an active thinking partner, and we want to theorize and understand how that intersection between a machine and a human can help make us more intelligent and help make us more productive. So from an education end, for just the last couple of slides here, I just want to emphasize that learning in this kind of a setting changes because we now have something that is a knowing agent rather than only a tool that we use. And what we want to do is to support students where they can participate in the setting in a meaningful way. They're aware of bias, they're aware of possible AI errors, and they can engage in a substantive way to promote the positive impact for all students that are involved. And what kinds of knowledge processes should we plan to do? And what should we just hand off to the machine that does it much better than humans could even do? And so these are some of the sort of key questions that we need to understand from an AI side in terms of implications to the school system. And there's a number of things that come in very practical learning ways. So for example, when we have